Welcome to Module 1, Lecture 3. In our earlier lectures, we learned what networks are and how to measure them. Now we ask a new question. What kinds of financial networks actually exist in the real world? Exposure, ownership, and correlation are all networks, but they do not represent the same economic reality. Let's look at this closely. In one case, the edges may represent loans. In another, they may represent ownership stakes. In another, they may represent price similarity rather than any direct contract. So one of the most important lessons today is that the meaning of a network depends on what the nodes and edges stand for. We are moving from general graph theory into concrete economic applications. Rather than one single network, we actually have many overlapping network forms, each revealing a different hidden structure of the economy. You can see 6 examples laid out across the page. At the top left, a random topology is linked to interbank markets and liquidity flow. In the middle, a hub-and-spoke topology represents interbank contagion and cascades. On the top right, a dense topology is associated with stock correlations and market synchronization. On the bottom row, a hierarchical topology represents corporate ownership and control, a flow topology captures supply chain dependency, and a cycle topology relates to transactions and possibly illicit activity. Think of it this way. The economy has different layers of plumbing, power, and communication, and each one creates its own network map. So when we study finance through networks, we are not choosing one picture. We are choosing the right picture for the question we want to answer. Now we move to our first concrete example, interbank liability networks. On this slide, the nodes are banks, and the arrows between them represent loans or derivative exposures. Notice that these edges are both directed and weighted. Directed means the obligation flows in a specific direction, and weighted means the link has a magnitude, such as $5 million or $10 million. The diagram highlights bank B2 in red to show a default event. Once B2 fails, the value of the assets held by connected banks can fall, especially if they were relying on payment from that bank. You can see how losses begin to spread toward B1 and B3. This is the basic contagion mechanism in liability networks. The slide also points out the topological feature of a core periphery structure. That means a dense center of highly connected institutions interacts with a less connected outer ring. The key intuition is that distress inside the dense core does not stay local for long, because the core is tightly interconnected. A failure can propagate rapidly across the entire system, just as we saw in the Lehman Brothers example during the global financial crisis. Core periphery architecture. Let's break that down. In the middle, you see a dense blue cluster. That is the core, made up of globally systemically important banks, sometimes called GSIBs. These institutions lend to and borrow from one another extensively. Around the outside, you see many lightly connected peripheral nodes. These represent regional banks or smaller firms that mainly connect into the core rather than to each other. Why does this structure emerge? Because the core acts like a central hub for liquidity distribution. It is efficient, since money and funding can move quickly through the system. A structure that is efficient in normal times can become fragile in crisis times. If one key core institution fails, the freeze can spread through the whole network. That is where the phrase too interconnected to fail comes from. So efficiency and fragility can coexist, which is one of the most important themes in network finance. Here we deepen the interbank example by linking topology to centrality and the cascade effect. The slide places Lehman Brothers at the center of many surrounding institutions, making the visual message very strong. This was not just a large bank, but a structurally central one. The text mentions eigenvector centrality and PageRank centrality. These measures do not simply count the number of links, they ask whether a node is connected to other important nodes. So Lehman's failure was especially dangerous because its influence was embedded within a highly connected financial core. On the right side of the slide, we see 2 channels of transmission. One is counterparty risk, meaning direct losses suffered by institutions exposed to Lehman. The other is liquidity hoarding, which is a more indirect effect. Once panic begins, institutions stop trusting each other and start holding on to cash. This can trigger funding runs and credit withdrawal. The result is a domino effect, where what begins as a localized problem turns into a systemic crisis. You might notice how this slide moves us beyond simple bilateral exposure and into the idea that network position amplifies shocks in non-linear ways. Now we switch to a completely different kind of network, Asset correlation networks. This is a great example of why not every financial network is about contracts or liabilities. Here the nodes are assets, such as Apple, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. And the edges represent price correlation, written on the slide as RHOIJ. Correlation means the degree to which two asset prices move together. If they rise and fall in similar patterns, they are strongly correlated. The slide introduces a key technique called the minimum spanning tree, originally associated with Mantegna. The idea is to filter out noise from a fully connected correlation matrix so that we can reveal the market's hidden hierarchy. Think of it this way. Diversification works best when your assets do not all move together. But if many assets are highly connected in a correlation network, your portfolio may be more concentrated than it appears. So portfolio risk is not just about what you own, but where your assets sit in the topology of the market. This slide explains the pipeline for building stock correlation networks. On the far left, we begin with time series, meaning historical price data for many assets. From those time series, we construct a correlation matrix, which is a table showing how strongly each asset moves with every other asset. This raw matrix is fully connected and noisy. Almost everything has some correlation with everything else, so it is hard to see meaningful structure. That is why the next step is thresholding or filtering. We remove weak or spurious links, keeping only the more informative relationships. On the far right, the result is a cleaner network where community structure becomes visible. You can see clusters of similarly colored nodes, suggesting groups of stocks that move together, perhaps because they belong to the same sector or respond to similar macroeconomic forces. The key line at the bottom is worth emphasizing. Assets are linked by similarity, not liability. That makes this network fundamentally different from interbank exposures. It does not show who owes whom. It shows who behaves like whom. This slide zooms in on one powerful filtering method, the minimum spanning tree, or MST. The full market network in the background is extremely dense, but the highlighted blue skeleton shows only the most essential links. The MST extracts the fundamental hierarchy of the market without loops, often grouping stocks naturally by sector, such as finance or technology, and it can do this without human supervision. That is very elegant. The mathematical idea uses a distance measure derived from correlation. D sub ij equals the square root of 2 times 1 minus ratio ij. Let's interpret that. If two assets are highly correlated, RHO is large, so the distance becomes small. In other words, assets that move together are treated as close neighbors in the network. Then an algorithm like Kruskal's or Prim's selects the most important links needed to connect all nodes without creating cycles. Think of the MST as the market's backbone. It strips away clutter and leaves behind the architecture that matters most for understanding hierarchy, clustering, and possible channels of co-movement. Our third major example is corporate control and ownership networks. Here, the nodes are transnational corporations, or TNCs, and the edges represent ownership stakes. This means the network is about power and control rather than lending or correlation. The visual shows a very interesting structure with an in component on the left, an out component on the right, and a strongly connected component, or SCC, in the center. The center is labeled as the core, and the slide calls it a super entity. That phrase captures the idea that a relatively small, tightly interconnected group of financial institutions may control a disproportionately large share of the global economy. This is a striking result in ownership network analysis. The implication written at the bottom is structural fragility and synchronized business cycles. Why? Because if control is concentrated in a dense core, then decision-making, governance, and strategic reactions may become synchronized. That can amplify common behavior across firms. So this network teaches us that concentration of ownership is not just a corporate governance issue, it can also become a systemic risk issue. This slide helps us understand the mechanism of corporate control more carefully by distinguishing control from cash flow. You can see several ultimate owners at the top, including individuals and a state authority, and firms arranged below them. Some ownership links are majority stakes, shown with solid arrows, while others are minority stakes, shown with dashed arrows. The crucial point on the right side is that control is transitive. In plain language, that means an entity can control a target firm indirectly through chains of ownership. If A controls B and B controls C, then A may effectively influence C, even without directly owning most of it. This creates what the slide calls network power, which can exceed direct equity ownership. Think of it like a chain of command. The formal legal ownership at each step may look modest, but once you trace the full network path, the effective control can be substantial. This is why ownership networks are often studied using directed graphs and why simple pairwise shareholding percentages can miss the true concentration of control. We now turn to transactional and fraud networks, which are another very different application of graph theory. In this case, the nodes are accounts and the edges are financial transfers. The central question is forensic rather than macroprudential. Can the topology of transactions reveal suspicious behavior? The slide highlights two important motifs. The first is cycles, where money loops back toward its origin. This can be a red flag for money laundering because circular flows may be used to disguise the true source or destination of funds. The second motif is scatter-gather behavior. That means money fans out from one node to many nodes and then later converges back in. This pattern can suggest layering, concealment, or coordinated movement of funds. What is interesting here is that we are not only studying the amount of money transferred, we are studying the shape of the transfers. So once again, topology becomes information. A transaction network can reveal hidden intent through repeated structural patterns, even when individual transactions look ordinary in isolation. This slide expands the idea of networks beyond finance in the narrow sense and into supply chain systems. The diagram is shaped almost like a bow tie. On the left are many suppliers, on the right are many buyers or customers, and at the center is one focal firm marked in red. The slide calls this a single point of failure. That phrase is crucial. If the focal node is disrupted, the downstream network can freeze because the flow of goods is interrupted. Unlike interbank liability networks, where the edges represent claims or obligations, here the edges represent the movement of physical goods or services. But the systemic logic is surprisingly similar. The network can still be fragile if too much dependence is concentrated in one place. These networks can be measured empirically. The key takeaway is that lack of redundancy creates vulnerability. If there are no substitute suppliers, no alternative logistics routes, and no backup counterparties, then a shock at one node can become a systemic bottleneck. This slide shows how network thinking can also help detect anomalies in supply chains. At the center is Enterprise A, with many arrows showing actual inflows from suppliers and actual outflows to customers. But to the right, there is a large question mark next to reported performance that is described as inflated or high. Reported performance does not match the network. In other words, the company's public numbers may be inconsistent with the actual pattern of business relationships visible in the transaction structure. This is a powerful idea. Instead of checking reports one line at a time, network analysis compares claimed outcomes with the economic footprint implied by counterparties and flows. If a firm says it is doing extraordinary business, but the surrounding supply network looks too weak or too sparse to support that claim, that discrepancy may signal manipulation or misreporting. So the network becomes a tool for validation. It helps us ask whether the story told by the data is structurally plausible. This slide gives us a comparative taxonomy of financial networks, and it is one of the most important summary views in the lecture. The table compares 5 types: interbank, stock correlation, ownership, supply chain, and transaction networks. For each one, it tells us what the nodes represent, what the edges mean, and what the primary topology usually looks like. Interbank networks use banks as nodes, and liabilities, or loans as edges, often producing a core periphery structure. Stock correlation networks use companies as nodes and price similarity as edges, often showing clusters or communities. Ownership networks involve shareholders and firms connected by equity or voting rights, often forming hierarchical directed acyclic graphs, or DAGs. Supply chain networks use firms connected by goods and service flows, often creating bow tie or flow structures. Transaction networks use accounts and payments, often revealing bipartite patterns or cycles. The sentence at the bottom captures the whole lecture beautifully. Different questions require different maps. In other words, the topology is dictated by the economic function. Before analyzing a network, we must first understand what kind of economic relation it is meant to represent. We conclude with a broad synthesis about the structural determinants of risk. The shield image on the left is a nice metaphor, suggesting that understanding structure is part of protecting the system. The first bullet reminds us that financial systems are complex and evolving topologies, not just collections of balance sheets. That is a major conceptual shift. The second bullet says structure matters. Topologies such as core periphery or clustering influence resilience. Some structures absorb shocks better, while others transmit them more rapidly. The final bullet emphasizes application. From interbank contagion models like debt rank to fraud detection using motifs, graph theory gives us a practical calculus for systemic risk. The quotation at the bottom brings everything together. To understand the stability of the system, we must map the architecture of its connections. That is the central lesson of this lecture and really of the whole module so far. We do not understand a financial system fully by listing its parts. We understand it by studying how those parts are arranged, linked, and able to affect one another.